When the name Saruman is spoken, it evokes an image of betrayal, arrogance, and ultimately, ruin. Yet behind this despised figure lies a complex narrative of suffering, a hidden torment that underscores his descent from one of the most esteemed beings in Middle-earth to a corrupted shadow of his former self. Saruman, born Curumo, was a Maya spirit of Aule, whose craftsmanship and ingenuity were unparalleled. Yet, what led this once noble wizard to defy his purpose and fall so utterly? To understand Saruman's downfall, we must begin with his mission and his hubris. The Valar sent Saruman and the other Istari to Middle-earth with a solemn charge, to guide its free peoples in their resistance against Sauron, the Dark Lord. Saruman was chosen as the leader of their order, not merely for his knowledge, but for his commanding wisdom and gravitas. Indeed, he was the man of skill, one who possessed the intellect and craftiness to match Sauron himself. Yet even in the Undying Lands, seeds of pride had already taken root. Saruman's great affinity for Aule's arts, the forging of tools and the manipulation of matter, foreshadowed his later obsession with power and control. When Saruman arrived in Middle-earth, he presented himself as the archetype of a leader, confident, strategic, and astute. But the cracks in his facade emerged early on. His study of Sauron's devices, begun ostensibly to understand his foe, became a fascination, then a compulsion. He delved deeply into the annals of the Rings of Power, lingering upon their forging and the mechanisms of domination they symbolized. It was not enough to destroy Sauron. Saruman sought to surpass him. Saruman's hidden suffering began here, in this self-imposed isolation of thought. While Gandalf forged bonds with the peoples of Middle-earth, befriending hobbits, elves, and men, Saruman retreated into solitude, convinced that only he could grasp the complexities of the struggle against Sauron. This alienation became his prison. He started to resent his fellow Istari, particularly Gandalf, whose humility and growing rapport with others were an affront to Saruman's towering self-image. Saruman's suffering was not born of external forces, but of internal anguish, a relentless whisper of inadequacy masked by overconfidence. More tragic still, Saruman's fall was accelerated by a perverse mirror of his own virtues. His genius for understanding and crafting turned to manipulation. His eloquence, once a tool for leadership, became a weapon of deceit. Recall his voice. It had the power to enthrall, to ensnare the minds of others. This was no gift of Morgoth. It was Saruman's own talent, corrupted by his desire to dominate rather than guide. The most damning implication of this transformation is that Saruman, in some twisted way, thought himself justified. Was he not ensuring the survival of Middle-earth by taking the reins of power into his hands? The tragedy of Saruman lies in this. He was not wholly wrong in his understanding of Sauron's methods. His suffering arose from a truth he could not reconcile. Middle-earth was vulnerable, and the free peoples were scattered and weak. Yet his solution, to replace Sauron with himself, was the ultimate betrayal of his charge. To understand Saruman's descent further, we must examine Orthanc, the tower where his downfall solidified. For centuries, it was a symbol of wisdom, a fortress of knowledge and power gifted to Saruman by the Steward of Gondor. Yet, as the years wore on, it became a place of secrecy, a labyrinth not of stone, but of the mind. Orthanc reflected Saruman's growing paranoia and ambition, housing his most forbidden studies. It was within Orthanc that Saruman began to craft his identity as Saruman of many colors, a profound and tragic abandonment of his original purpose. The White Council, formed to counter Sauron's resurgence, was intended to unify its members under a singular purpose. White, as Saruman himself once claimed, was a beginning, capable of reflecting all colors. Yet his adoption of a robe, woven with shifting hues, revealed the depth of his corruption. No longer did he view himself as a servant of a greater good. Instead, he believed in the supremacy of his own will, claiming to embody a wisdom that surpassed the simplicity of white. But this shift was not merely symbolic. Saruman's suffering was compounded by his need to justify his betrayal, not only to others, but to himself. When he argued with Gandalf in Orthanc, offering to share his imagined rule, Saruman laid bare the self-deception that defined him. He believed that the ends, defeating Sauron, justified the means, even if those means involved wielding the One Ring. Yet this reasoning was deeply flawed. For all his intellect, Saruman underestimated the ring's power to corrupt, believing himself immune to its influence. The Palantir, gifted to Saruman as a tool of wisdom, became another instrument of his undoing. Through it, he sought to observe Sauron, perhaps to understand his plans, or even to master him. But the Palantir was a double-edged sword. Sauron's will dominated Saruman's, exploiting his pride and filling his mind with fear. Here lies another layer of hidden suffering. Saruman, though proud and ambitious, was also deeply afraid. He saw Sauron's growing strength and despaired, convinced that open resistance was futile. His decision to align himself with Sauron, at least superficially, was born of this despair, a desperate bid to salvage what he could. Yet, there is an irony in Saruman's corruption. He believed himself superior to Sauron, even as he mirrored him. Both sought dominion through the rings of power. Both corrupted their realms to serve their ambitions. Saruman bred his own army of orcs and men, desecrating the natural beauty of Isengard in his quest for control. Like Sauron, he exploited others' fear and greed, bending them to his will. But unlike Sauron, whose evil was absolute, Saruman's fall retained a glimmer of tragedy. His suffering was not born of malice, but of a misguided belief that his wisdom could reshape the world. Orthanc itself became a microcosm of Saruman's torment. The once pristine gardens were replaced by furnaces and war machines, reflecting the decay of his soul. And yet, as Gandalf revealed, Saruman was not beyond redemption, at least not initially. Even after his defeat at Helm's Deep, Gandalf offered him a chance to repent, to abandon his path and seek renewal. But Saruman, trapped by his pride and self-loathing, refused. It is here that his hidden suffering reaches its peak. Saruman could not forgive himself. In rejecting Gandalf's mercy, he was not only defying his old friend, but also condemning himself to a fate of bitterness and ruin. As Saruman's plans unraveled, his suffering became increasingly public, yet no less hidden in its essence. His failed attempt to dominate Rohan revealed the depth of his hubris and the pettiness of his tactics. Saruman, who once plotted to rule all of Middle-earth, stooped to manipulating Theoden, a king whose strength was waning under the shadow of Wormtongue's whispers. This was not the grand strategy of a masterful tactician, but the desperate gambit of a once great mind unraveling. The contrast between Saruman and Sauron becomes stark here. While Sauron operated with a singular, unrelenting purpose, Saruman's goals fragmented as his power diminished. His suffering deepened as he realized that, despite his intellect, his ability to influence the course of events was slipping away. His armies of orcs and wild men were defeated at Helm's Deep. His fortress at Isengard was flooded by the Ents, and his authority was shattered by Gandalf, who stripped him of his staff and position within the Astari. Yet even in defeat, Saruman clung to his illusions of control. When he stood atop Orthanc, parleying with Gandalf and the victorious Rohirrim, he wielded his most potent weapon, his voice. Saruman's voice, described as capable of bending hearts and minds to his will, was a manifestation of his genius and his suffering. It was his last recourse, a tool to maintain the illusion of dominance even as he was surrounded by the ruins of his ambition. But Saruman's greatest crime, and the final manifestation of his inner torment, was his assault on innocence. After his expulsion from Orthanc, Saruman turned his malice toward the Shire, a land he had long dismissed as inconsequential. This move was not strategic, but spiteful. His suffering had transformed into hatred, and the Shire became a scapegoat for his failures. The Scouring of the Shire is one of the most poignant moments in Saruman's story, for it reveals the depth of his fall. The mighty wizard, once charged with protecting the free peoples, now sought to destroy a land of peace and simplicity. Why the Shire? Perhaps Saruman resented its innocence, its resistance to the corruption that had consumed him. In the hobbits, he saw a reflection of what he had lost, a life untainted by the hunger for power. Yet, in his final moments, Saruman revealed his ultimate suffering: loneliness. His servant Wormtongue, long abused and demeaned, turned on him, killing him in an act of desperate defiance. As Saruman fell, his body withered, and his spirit was cast into the void, denied even the solace of death. Saruman's end was not just a punishment, it was the culmination of his suffering. The Maiar, immortal spirits, are bound to the fate of Arda, and Saruman's spirit, like Sauron's, was left to wander, stripped of purpose and power. Unlike Sauron, however, Saruman's suffering was entirely self-inflicted. His fall was not predestined, but chosen, step by step, as he allowed his pride, fear, and ambition to consume him. Saruman's tragedy lies not in his failure, but in his potential. He could have been the greatest of the Istari, a beacon of hope in a darkening world. Instead, he became a warning, a reminder of how even the wisest can fall. Saruman's tale is not merely the story of a wizard who fell from grace. It is a lens through which we can examine some of the most profound themes in Tolkien's legendarium. The hidden suffering of Saruman is, at its heart, a meditation on pride, power, and the possibility of redemption, a theme Tolkien revisits across his works. What makes Saruman's fall particularly poignant is the path not taken. Throughout his journey, opportunities for redemption appear, though increasingly fleeting as his choices narrow. Gandalf's offer of mercy outside Orthanc was the most overt, but there were subtler chances earlier in Saruman's story. His initial fascination with the Rings of Power, for instance, could have been tempered had he sought counsel from others, rather than isolating himself. His use of the Palantir, too, need not have led to despair if he had trusted in the combined strength of the free peoples, rather than pursuing dominance alone. Saruman's story also reflects the corrupting influence of despair, a theme echoed in Denethor, Boromir, and others. Like Denethor, Saruman fell not because he lacked strength, but because he allowed his fear of defeat to override his hope for victory. This despair led him to believe that only by wielding Sauron's methods could he achieve his goals. Yet, as Tolkien reminds us time and again, evil cannot be defeated by evil means. In a broader sense, Saruman's suffering serves as a counterpoint to the resilience of Gandalf. Both began as Maiar spirits, sent by the Valar to aid Middle-earth in its darkest hour. Both faced the same trials, witnessed the same horrors, and wrestled with the same doubts. Yet where Gandalf embraced humility and hope, Saruman succumbed to pride and fear. This divergence underscores one of Tolkien's central messages: the choices we make, no matter how small, shape our destiny. The Scouring of the Shire, often seen as a mere epilogue to the grander tales of Middle-earth, is, in many ways, the culmination of Saruman's suffering and a final, bitter commentary on his character. Here, in this humble land, Saruman was confronted with the consequences of his pride. He sought to dominate the Shire, not for gain, but out of spite, a petty act that laid bare the depth of his degradation. And yet, even in this act, there is a lesson. The hobbits, embodying the resilience of the small and the simple, stood against him. Their victory was not one of might, but of courage and unity, a stark contrast to Saruman's solitary arrogance. Saruman's ultimate fate, a wandering spirit, bereft of power or purpose, invites reflection on Tolkien's views of mortality and immortality. Unlike the mortal races, the Maiar are bound to the world until its end, unable to escape their choices. Saruman's suffering, then, is eternal. Yet even in this bleak outcome, there is a glimmer of hope for readers. His fall serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us of the perils of pride and the redemptive power of humility. The hidden suffering of Saruman is as intricate as it is tragic. It is a story of wasted potential and self-inflicted wounds, but also a mirror held up to the reader, reflecting the choices we all face. Saruman, in the end, is not merely a villain, but a deeply flawed being whose torment serves as a reminder that even the greatest among us are not immune to the seductions of power and fear.